Welcome back to the Belonging at Work Summit. Our next guest is a truly dynamic self-care advocate, Aida Manduley. Aida is an award-winning Latinx activist, international presenter, and trauma-focused clinician known for big earrings and building bridges. Trained as a sexuality educator, social worker, and nonprofit management professional, they're working to make the world a more equitable place through education, therapy, and community organizing. One of many things I so appreciate about Aida is that their perspective centers intersectionality and maximizing kindness while retaining both a sense of humor and a sense of justice. From the New York Times to the Rainbow Times, Ms. Manduley has been interviewed by a variety of media outlets. They were even brought on for a debate on the Laura Ingraham Show, which for those not familiar is a popular conservative radio program, and Live to Tell the Tale. So given Aida's commitment to militant self-care for change agents, I'll be asking them to guide us through what it means, how community accountability can help us cultivate workplace cultures of belonging, and most importantly, how Aida's work can help us take better care of ourselves so that we can bring our best selves to work. And at the end of our discussion, you'll walk away with many strategies on how you can nurture your health, well-being, and creativity to continue being the change you wish to see in the world. Okay, so Aida, thank you so much for making the time to be a part of the summit, and welcome. I'm really thrilled to have you here. To kick off the interview, can you, in your clinical and consulting practice, you're doing a lot of innovative work around community accountability and militant self-care. So help us kind of frame our conversation by just taking some time to define these terms, recognizing that our audience is largely composed of folks that are managing change to make their workplaces more inclusive.
Totally. And especially with clarifying terms, I feel like that's important to do in any case. So I'm glad that you're modeling that behavior right here.
Thank you.
So I'm pleased to be here. So community accountability and militant self-care. I'll tackle the community accountability piece first. So accountability itself doesn't necessarily have to relate to harm. That's the way that I deal with it. I deal with community accountability in instances of harm. But accountability in general is the state or practice of accepting responsibility for the actions that we take and or acknowledging the obligations that we have due to our actions or due to our membership in a group. In the context that I work in, like I said, it's primarily around taking care of harm and supporting communities and community building. So at its most basic, it's just that, a community-based strategy as opposed to a prison-based strategy or a larger system or government-based strategy, which is usually what a lot of us in the United States and other countries use as a way to deal with harm. So if harm happens, we usually think, what was the crime that was committed? How can we punish this person? And usually the punishment looks like excising the person from community and not really planning to reintegrate them in any meaningful way. So community accountability, as opposed to that, has a different set of tenets and a different set of ideas behind it. So the way that I work with community accountability incorporates the principles of restorative and transformative justice. Those two are not exactly the same, but for the purposes of this interview, I will collapse them and kind of combine them. But you can certainly read more about why and how those are different elsewhere. So with the frames of RJ and TJ, as I'll refer to them here, there's a lot of focus on community participation. There's a lot of focus on restorative rather than punitive approaches. So rather than how do we punish this person into being a better person, how do we look at restoring the harm and supporting the people that were harmed and all of us taking responsibility for the harm that occurred, which is pretty different than how most of us deal with harm, right? And in a workplace, if someone doesn't do their job, often that is a person that gets singled out as, well, you didn't do your job. You didn't meet the outcomes for the term and the objectives that we set out in your job description. And there's less of a focus, especially in unhealthy workplaces, there's less of a focus on how did the environment of the job actually make that happen and facilitate that lack of responsibility or that lack of outcome or whatever. So there's a lot of ways that this looks like in community, but I'll be focusing a little bit more on the workplace component of it. Rather than just, out on the streets, though they're very related and similar in the end. Yes. As far as connecting it specifically to the organizations, community accountability really is about creating a workplace culture and community that can not just address harm, but also help prevent harm, knowing that harm will undoubtedly happen, right? This is not about, if you prevent it well enough, it will never occur. It's about mutuality. It's about interdependence. It's about us all taking care of each other rather than having the one person whose job it is to take care of each other, right? So in a lot of workplaces, oh, it's HR. That's HR's job. Yeah. Sure, to some extent, it is useful to have a department that their job is to take care of the workers, but it should be a mentality that infuses the workplace. So generally what I'm asking folks to do is actually pretty both large and small, because I'm asking people to do a mind shift of how they look at harm and how they look at their workplace culture. But it's easier than people think, right? So it's big and small at the same time. Militant self-care is a term that I've been using for a bunch of years. However, I also want to acknowledge that, the world is amazing and other people have also been using this term. And to me, part of being accountable is doing that, right? Rather than, I made this up by myself. In absence of context, I want to recognize Tashmika Tarak, who works with the Firecracker Foundation, who also uses the term militant self-care and has actually built a lot more infrastructure than I personally have around it. So she's also someone who's really great in doing that work, and I would recommend folks check her out. So for me, though, the way that I talk about it, it's self-care that is incorporating and also rooted in the idea of community. So rather than a very individualized idea of self-care, which is mostly what people are talking about in corporate environments at this point, if they are even talking about self-care at all. This really sees the individual as part of a whole. It challenges superficial notions of what self-care is, right? So it's not just bubble baths, not just a pedicure. It can totally incorporate those things, but it should not be solely that. So the reason I use the word militant specifically is because it's active and it's intentional. It's radical, and at time it is aggressive, and it aggressively asserts our right to exist, and it is unapologetic about its necessity. So it's not the kind of self-care that's like, oh, I guess if I have extra time on Friday, I'll maybe take some time off from work. No, this is actually a priority that cannot be set to the sideline, and we have to be militant in our demanding of that, particularly under structures of capitalism. And I know that, folks watching this may have a variety of opinions about capitalism and its role. I have very particular ideas about it, which I will discuss at length today. But regardless of if you're a capitalist or not, I think this topic is really important. Whether it's because you want to maximize the productivity of your employees, or because you want to dismantle the entire system that requires a lot of the structures that we've built around punishment. So either way, I think you're going to get something out of it. And at its core, militant self-care is about compassion and context. It's about not pretending that we are something that we're not, pretending that we have more bandwidth to do work than we actually have. And an analogy that I tend to use is, for most of us, not all of us, but for most of us, if we sprain our ankle or we sprain a muscle or something when we're walking, working out, whatever, we generally are told, and generally hopefully follow through, that we need to give it some time to heal, right? Mm-hmm. So if our ankle's busted, we should not be running to the gym the next day. We should not be running a marathon the next day. We should ice it. We should put some compresses on it. I'm not a physical therapist, so that's as much as I know about dealing with a sprain. But You're supposed to kind of give it some space to heal rather than continue to exacerbate and inflammate your ankle. Yeah. Most of us are very clear about that when it comes to physical bodies. When it comes to emotions, when it comes to mental health, most of us are terrible. We're like, oh, I can just keep doing this. I can keep spraining my ankle, my mental ankle, because it's not as clearly physical. Because we don't see it as clearly, we put a lot of pressure on it. And so the idea of militant self-care is that it incorporates that notion of healing, that notion of restoration, not just, oh, I need to rescue myself every couple of months because I've burnt out, right? It's the practice of making yourself and the way that you work sustainable enough so that you don't have to be rescuing yourself every couple of months or every couple of weeks.
Yeah, thank you for walking us through how you talk about these two terms. And one of the takeaways that I had from what you were just sharing with us is that both terms are about all of us, right? And so I really think kind of centering the responsibility, like you said, on the accountability piece, if we're thinking about the workplace, it's not just HR's job. It's kind of where do we fit in on making sure that we're accountable to others and that we're not discarding people. And then on the other side is for militant self-care, that it is about all of us and it's not on any individual to take the bubble bath or, I don't know, get the massage or whatever, whatever is being pushed out there. So let's first kind of go into the accountability piece, because I do think that that's really helpful for what we've been talking about this week. And when we're thinking about the workplace, help us understand how we might be able to transform conditions when we talk about intent and impact. So if someone has a good intention, that intention lands in a way that has harmed another person, how might we be able to incorporate this concept of a community accountability into a workplace setting?
The first thing that we have to get rid of, and I say get rid of, and I'm being a little bit dramatic. We're not going to get rid of it, but we can minimize it, is either or thinking, also known as black and white thinking. So if you're a therapist or have been in therapy, you may have heard that already. But it's a popular term outside of therapeutic context as well. And what either or thinking is a binary way of looking at the world that says there's a single right way, a single wrong way. This is yes or no. It is male or female. And it collapses the actuality of human diversity and human potential in a way that I think is detrimental to innovation, detrimental to business, detrimental to living in general. So I can yell about that for a long time. I will not. But that's the first thing, right? So the trick that I tell people is if you or someone is telling you that there's only one or that there are only two options for anything, that is a lie. Yeah. There is always at least a third way, and usually fourth, fifth, sixth. Yes. So if you are realizing or feeling really stuck, right? Because that's what happens to a lot of people. They feel really stuck and panicked or angry when they have to make a choice that doesn't feel authentic or good to them. Know that there's another way. If you can't figure it out solo, see who else in your community, whether that's a friend, a boss, a therapist, a random person on the street at times, can help you get unstuck. That's thing number one that we have to build and practice, right? That's not just let me do that once a week. That is we have to infuse that into our everyday thinking. And most of us were not trained to do that. Most of us were not taught to do that. And we're in fact taught the opposite. So if you're struggling with that and struggling with not having kind of more non-binary thinking, you just were a really good student. You were a really good student of the idea that everything is a binary. So have some compassion for yourself and still work to change it. The other piece is getting clear on your organizational values. A lot of organizations, and I've done this with nonprofits and corporations, a lot of organizations either don't have their values listed, they don't have them articulated, or if they do, which is amazing, they don't do anything with them. Yeah. They just sit on a shelf, sit in a staff manual, sit on a website, doing nothing. And so if you don't have organizational values, make those happen, right? And there's a couple ways of doing that, but make those happen. Update them frequently, like do an annual review or a biannual review or whatever makes sense for your organizational size. And actually know them deeply, use them as a guiding framework in your everyday work. So rather than thinking about them just once a year, bring them up at literally every staff meeting. And I use the word literally on purpose, every staff meeting. How are we aligning with our vision? How are we aligning with our values today? If we have a workplace conflict, let's look at our values. How would our values dictate that we address this? And just by doing that, you're getting closer to being authentic and being kind of whatever organization you want to be. Not every organization is going to have the same values, obviously, but do what you're going to do and do it well. Obviously, I have some values that I would put forth, including accountability, sustainability, but whatever your organization is doing, just make sure that you're doing it conscientiously and regularly. Also develop those and develop strategies for accountability collectively. That's another problem that I see in a lot of organizations where they do a top-down, I'm going to enforce the law and this is how we do it. This is the staff manual. No one really has any input beyond the executive director or the founder or whoever it is that made it up. Maybe it was just HR, right? And so that's one of the big strategies that needs to take place so that you have buy-in, that you have engagement, that you have trust. And those are three of the key pieces to building a healthy workplace culture and a workplace culture that actually can do accountability work. Because a
Yeah.
lot of organizations get really focused on, oh, there was harm or there was sexual misconduct, let's fix it. But there's no basis of trust. There's no foundation of community, right? The community is, I guess we work here. And that's not enough. That's not enough to actually do accountability processes.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because in kind of this 3-step approach that you were talking about, kind of embracing the both and rather than the either or thinking, and getting clear on your values, and then thinking about the strategies for accountability, that it's not a cookie cutter approach. The steps are the same. You might be working with one organization to the next, but you're also recognizing that there's a culture within those organizations, and you're trying to engage the entire, the folks who show up to do the work, to get that kind of buy-in. So I think that's a really helpful approach of just how to, for those watching, just thinking about how to adapt this concept of community accountability into the workplace. So thank you for doing that. On the other side, when we're talking about militant self-care, you ground your clinical practice in liberation health and healing justice frameworks. So help us understand what those frameworks are and how they might also be adapted to support those of us, trying to heal our workplaces or trying to make our workplaces the workplaces of the future where we know that we belong.
Excellent. And again, here's where I'm going to give a nod to the people that made these frameworks up, because it was not me, right? I'm a person that speaks on them, but I'm not the originator. So Don Belkin Martinez is one of the folks that sort of founded and explored the topic of liberation health. It's an approach that began more in the social sciences and specifically social work, right? Which is one of the places and spaces that I was trained in. And liberation health is both a theory of human behavior and a method of practice. And really what it looks like is it acknowledges, again, a lot of these models that I'm using are kind of just saying the same thing with different words. The idea here is that we cannot understand people or families in isolation. We cannot understand organizations in isolation. We need to look at the economic, sociopolitical, cultural, and historical conditions that gave place to that and kind of gave way to that. And so the idea of liberation health specifically is we look at those factors every single time. Every time there's an issue, every time there's an intervention, we need to look at the personal, cultural, and institutional factors. Some of the key pieces of liberation health too are that it is hopeful, it is change-oriented, and it both acknowledges history and also plans for the future. So it looks at how have we changed before? How can that inform our change coming up? With Healing Justice, Kara Page and the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective are two of the big names of Healing Justice. And Healing Justice specifically has been really grounded in communities of color, and particularly Black communities, Indigenous communities in the South as well. So the idea of Healing Justice is that healing has to happen intergenerationally, right? We're not going to heal in just one generation, and it's not the job of just one generation to do the healing. It has to be collaborative. We have to honor ancestry, whatever that ancestry is, right? And really quickly to speak to the folks on who are listening who might not identify as having ancestry, right? A lot of white people are like, I'm just white, I'm an ally and an accomplice, but I'm just white. Mm-hmm. Whiteness comes from somewhere, and there are different flavors of whiteness under the umbrella of who is considered white, and that has changed over time. So everyone has an ancestry, and the idea of Healing Justice is that we acknowledge all that ancestry and all the complexity of it, right? So some of our ancestors were slave owners. Some of our ancestors were slaves. Some of our ancestors were colonizers. Some of our ancestors lived on islands for thousands of years before having contact with anyone else. And so not forgetting that and seeing how can we bring that into the present day. Healing Justice is a strengths-based kind of approach. So rather than seeing people as problems to be fixed, we see the problems kind of separately in the social context, and we think of what are people doing to survive and what have they done to survive without judgment. So this also connects to a lot of harm reduction mentalities and frameworks. And also sort of finally, Healing Justice values sustainability. It challenges the systems that keep us from healing. And some of us would say capitalism is one of them. And capitalism is actually one of the biggest ones. Also white supremacy, another really big one that challenges our healing and does not allow us, regardless of race, to heal. and it incorporates environmental care and acknowledgement. So when we talk about self-care, when we talk about workplace culture and environment, very, very rarely do we talk about the physical plant, the environment around the office, the land that we're on, the environmental impact of whatever it is that we're doing, right? I've been in very few meetings that when developing a strategic plan, they have a section about environmental care. And our planet is not in a great place right now. So, you know, what use are our staff manual is going to be 50 years from now if global warming has eroded all our shorelines and, you know, increased the temperature such that everything is, you know, wrecked. And especially for the people who are in the global south, and especially for people who are not wealthy, right? Because the people who have wealth will generally find resources, even in climate catastrophe. But there are a lot of people who won't. So those are the two big frameworks that I use.
Yeah, and I think those frameworks are super helpful. And like you said, you know, they come from other folks who've been working on these and adapting from other frameworks. And so it's kind of using, you know, new ways of talking about tactics or approaches that have been called something different in the past. And so I think for those watching, it's always helpful if it's framed in a way that resonates with you and you feel like you can adapt that, great. You know, and if it's not necessarily in alignment with the culture of your workplace, how might you be able to adapt it, calling it something in alignment with these principles, maybe something that could be a little more palatable for those within your workplace. So I appreciate that. And I think that they're very helpful related to this topic broadly. So I kind of wanted to switch or just kind of pivot to taking this topic and conversation a little bit further by recognizing that something that you're known for is fostering spaces where women of color and some non-binary folks can build meaningful professional relationships by offering emotional resources to uplift women of color in particular. So, and this comes from your website, so I really like the way that that's framed. And one question that I had was in thinking about these emotional resources, you know, what are they? Can you share some examples of what emotional resources are that you've developed or that you may use from other folks who have developed these? And how might they be able to help those of us trying to foster similar places in our organizations where we may need to have conversations with women of color, or with non-binary folks, or those at the intersections? Like how do you go about cultivating these spaces, and then how do you support them with these emotional resources?
Yeah. And that's also, you know, doing a callback to what we talked about earlier in terms of just community building. Yeah. Honestly, that's what it is. It's community building and community organizing. And for a lot of folks that are trained to be executive directors or who are trained in more corporate spaces, usually when it comes to community building, it's less of a political thing and it's more of a how do you build your base to get funding, which is neat. I also was trained in that, super useful. But the piece that's often missing is the human part. Yeah. And so in terms of the resources, really it's building spaces where people can come together, building spaces where people can connect with each other and authentically, not just for quote unquote networking purposes. What can you do for me? You know, what can I do for you? What are the ways that our struggles are interlinked? And so sometimes that looks like getting folks together to vent and see, hey, you're not alone, right? I was one of the folks that convened a clinicians of color group in Boston, for example. And initially, you know, we had the hope that it would be a space where people could vent if they needed. But initially, part of the dream was to have it be a space where we could discuss clinical cases together and not just use white frameworks and white clinicians' frameworks for addressing harm in our communities. And that happened. But honestly, the biggest piece that people were hungry for, they were starving for, was I just want to know that I'm not alone. Right? I'm the only person in my agency who's Black. I'm the only person in my agency who's, you know, whatever minority. And it's so alienating and lonely. And people needed a space where they could be with their people or people that were like them to just vent. And sometimes what that venting looked like and what that yielded was community building and resource sharing. So the way that we structured the events was we had a monthly meeting, and now it's on hiatus because of logistics, but we had a monthly meeting. We had time for clinical conversations, but we also had time for some kind of macro conversation about something that was happening in the world, whether it was self-care or climate justice, or, hey, there's this bill that's getting introduced in the Massachusetts Senate that we should be thinking about for mental health reasons. And we were always thinking of both the micro and the macro, not one at the expense of the other. And giving people a space to connect with each other. So every time, every single meeting, it was a drop-in meeting. So there were people that were new each time. We had introductions. And generally in, again, more corporate environments, introductions either don't happen or they happen very swiftly. And the idea is just say your name, say your pronoun maybe, move on. And we actually took up a lot of time. Sometimes half the meeting was just introductions. And under most of our training and under the culture of white supremacy, we don't really give time for that. And we see it as a waste of time, and it's not profitable. And again, I could debunk that, and, you know, I could yell about that for a long time, but part of building community is acknowledging the human that you see in front of you, not just seeing them as a dollar sign, right? Yeah. And that requires time, and that is an investment, right? So if you think that time is money, what I'm asking you to do is invest the time and the money to build the human relationships that will actually sustain your work and make it so that your workplace culture can be a healthy one. Because as some people have said, people don't leave jobs or people are not fired from jobs. What they leave is the culture of the workplace that is usually toxic. And if you can transform that culture, that does a lot for retention. That does a lot, especially if you're thinking of diversity retention, it can do a lot. So just giving people a space, building in the micro and macro together rather than separating them, and moving resources within your agency such that that can be supported. Because often it's the people with the greatest need that have the highest burden and the highest workload to then build their own community. So what would it look like at an organization if the organization said, hey, we want to have, an LGBT caucus, or we want to have a, staff of color meeting? Can the organization provide food? If it's after hours, can they provide childcare or transportation? Can they provide office space? Can they provide office supplies? Can one of the staff members who's white and an accomplice or an ally type up the notes? Can they be the scribe? There's so many ways. We just have to get creative. There's so many ways to actually move resources around and support each other that we have to break out of the boxes of, just build community. You clearly need it. Go over there and do it. So again, back to the idea of how do we implicate all of us in this change? And that's just one example of a community space that I've built and have worked with. If we're looking for other examples, right, of emotional resources or how to apply it specifically to organizations, one is having education about trauma. A lot of people who aren't therapists don't necessarily see the importance of that. As someone who straddles the lines of clinical work and non-clinical work, I see the deep need for trauma education, regardless of what field you're in. I don't care what field you're in, you need trauma education, because I can guarantee you that a lot of people in your workplace are traumatized, and that is one of the main reasons, not the only one, but one of the main reasons you see folks acting out. And if you actually address the roots of the trauma, whether that's racial trauma, sexual trauma, whatever, you will actually be able to better equip your staff to address problems, because they will have a better language and they will have better ideas of what is actually going on. Rather, an example from a nonprofit that I used to work at, there were communication issues that in part were intergenerational and cultural. Right? Like people expected different things, what if you end your email with a period versus an exclamation mark? Are you using emojis? Is that unprofessional? Right? There's a lot about intergenerational workplaces that we can talk about. Yes. And one of the pieces that had to come out was, what were people reacting to, right? We're generally not reacting just to the person that's in front of us. There's usually some older wound or older problem or older interaction that we're actually responding to. And so when we can get clarity on, I'm really anxious when I get an email that ends with a period because I think the person is mad at me, that changes the conversation. So it's not a, oh, you need to end your emails differently.
Right.
The end, right? It's, this is what I would need, or can I clarify, is this what you meant, right? And so the education about trauma, education, this is a little bit more clinical, not everyone's going to do this, but education about attachment and attachment in the workplace. There's some really interesting literature on that I would recommend people check out, because it discusses how we connect or disconnect from folks. That gives us also different frameworks for understanding anger in the workplace. It gives us different ways of understanding leadership in the workplace. And when you have conflict under ideas of white supremacy culture, which I want to also highlight, Tema Okun has written amazing stuff on white supremacy culture. Check that out specifically. It has a lot of direct actionables that I'm not going to repeat here because they're already so clearly laid out. One of the pieces that it calls out in terms of white supremacy culture is this idea of fear of open conflict. And so a lot of workplaces, and frankly, a lot of what HR departments are there for, is to squash conflict, minimize it, hide it, make it go away, rather than heal it, rather than transform it, rather than actually fix it. And so if we can get better at having open conflict, tolerating the distress of conflict, and sorting through the path of a conflict and what steps you're supposed to take, that is radical. The organizations that I've worked with that have instituted those methods and have researched, white supremacy culture, researched workplace attachment, researched what is the path of a conflict and how can it be transformed, have transformed their workplaces into things that, from things that were toxic and unsustainable and probably going to die in like a year or two, or continue puttering for years, but everyone hating the workplace, into places that are thriving, that sometimes are smaller, that sometimes have a different outcome set than initially envisioned, but actually people are excited to work at, people are excited to be in, and are great ambassadors for the work, rather than, oh, I guess I work here and I don't love it, and I'm just going to be complaining all the time.
So on the open conflict, I love this concept. In the work that you're doing, or for other colleagues that you are collaborating with, do you have examples of programs or just facilitated discussions that are happening right now that might be helpful for some folks who are like, yes, like I'm feeling this, I'm feeling when things bubble up, our HR team or other leaders on the team kind of look the other way, or like you said, just kind of squash it, minimize it, and then move forward. And then that just kind of builds the resentment and more of the toxic kind of workplaces that we want to avoid kind of replicating in our own organization. So any kind of immediate resources that come to mind?
I would love to shout out a colleague of mine, actually.
Yeah, please.
And I'll share a little bit of a story about her. Her name is Bianca Laureano. She is an Afro-Latina Puerto Rican sexologist, community builder, movement, shaker, maker. She's fabulous in a lot of ways. And a lot of my initial interactions with her felt extremely negative. And I'll share a tiny story to illustrate it, because also stories hold a lot of power, and we are better at remembering those than facts. I was working at an organization that was predominantly white and white-led and white-founded, and it was a sexuality organization. And I say this not to put the organization on blast or anything, but this is what happened, and it's important to share. And there was we had featured someone on our website, and later there were some allegations about this person's sexual misconduct and like deep violating things that they had done. And as we had been emailing other people to feature on the website, we kind of simultaneously got 2 emails back from potential additions. One of them from Bianca, one of them from a white, actually pretty famous YouTuber in the sexuality sphere. And they both are basically saying the same thing with very different tones. Both of them were expressing a lot of concern about being featured alongside this person who had been accused of misconduct. They were wondering why we still had them up, and they were kind of encouraging us to change something, make a statement or whatever. The white woman was very deferential. She was like, ooh, I have this concern. I don't know. It was not aggressive, not confrontational. It was very friendly, whatever. Bianca's email was very straightforward, very direct. And, from what I recall, someone could even maybe call it aggressive. I don't know. The white founder of this organization obviously had a very different reaction to both of those emails, even though they essentially were saying the exact same thing. The package was different, right? And the relationship she had to both of those was different. I'll shorten the story a little bit, but things escalated a little bit more. Bianca had a personal blog where she was writing about her life and her experiences, and she wrote about the interactions that she had with our organization and the founder, and discussed them using the language of white supremacy, using the language of, white people, some, say like whitey or things like that. And the executive director took a lot of offense to that. She was not in a place where she was able to listen to what was being said because she was so hurt. And also, she was a WASP. She came from a culture where you don't acknowledge conflict at all. So why would you do this, right? So this all felt extremely aggressive and offensive to her. And as a staff member at the time, and you know what? I was also earlier on my racial justice journey, and I was also like, yeah, she was aggressive, but like, let's listen anyway. And at this point, I have a very different emotional reaction to that set of emails. And so that just to highlight, even when your message is good, sometimes people will not listen because of their own baggage, right? And so with the executive director, her whiteness, her inability to handle open conflict compromised not just her relationship with Bianca, who's a brilliant person and a brilliant strategist and educator. It compromised her relationship with me at the moment too, because I saw the whiteness and the defensiveness. I was like, ooh, what would this look like if I had something to tell you? Do I have to, we had 3-4 hour long conversations as colleagues and friends about it. And there was a lot of emotional labor that had to be expended to settle the situation down. And again, there's a lot of juicy stuff behind the scenes that happened there too, that I'm not going to go into, but those kinds of situations are such missed opportunities.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. For the director, it was a missed opportunity to see a different way of being, to listen to a person, to connect to a person, to make your staff feel appreciated and listened to. And things evolved after that. She certainly changed her views over time about what happened and about Bianca and about myself. But I myself had to change my views on Bianca because I saw her initially as abrasive and aggressive and, open conflict, and ooh, that's scary, even though I'm also Puerto Rican and, I was working in white environments. Sure. And now we are close colleagues. And I have such a different visceral understanding of what it looks like to love radically, love openly, and thus speak to conflict openly. And that is an act of love and care. And it says, I think that you can do better. Right. Which is very different than I'm just not going to bother with you because I think that you're a lost cause. So if someone is watching this and they're part of a powered identity, so if you're white, if you're cisgender, if you're straight, whatever those are, and whatever combination you are those things. When someone is calling you out or when someone is saying, hey, this is a problem, regardless of how they package it, there is something in there. Maybe they're acting, aggressively. That's true. Maybe they're playing out their own wounds on top of you. That's also problematic. I know. But there's at least a nugget, if not a huge piece of that person that says, I have hope for you.
Yes.
I have hope that you can do better. I believe in you. Maybe I trust you. Maybe I care for you or love you. And I think that we can do this differently. So rather than seeing it as a challenge to your power or your authority, or solely as a challenge to your power and authority, see it as a gift, see it as an opportunity, see it as a way that you can grow and be better and be a better leader. Yes. I
jotted down a note. I'm smiling because it's kind of like, feedback as a gift. And I love that you just said that, and that takes a great deal, for the supervisor, the boss that you were talking about, this particular organization, to separate your ego, right, from what feels like a personalized attack to what Bianca was actually communicating, which was, like you said, you can do better. I believe that you can do better. here are some suggestions of how, right? And like you said, two different, from Bianca to the other white woman who also kind of wrote in just a different tone, a different way of framing it, and what people can hear. And I think it goes back to kind of inclusive leadership, which is getting curious. If you're getting feedback, regardless of the package that the feedback is coming in, getting curious about what is being communicated and having enough self-awareness about maybe your own biases that you have to manage. And I also like what you said about your own kind of racial justice journey, where at the time, you had found Bianca's feedback to be kind of quote unquote aggressive, and now you have a different take on that and what she was actually accomplishing, and a friendship developed from that. So it's thank you for sharing the story and being so candid with us, because I think that can help folks in really understanding what open conflict can look like, and that it's not a bad thing. It's just, you kind of have to park your ego off to the side and figure out kind of what information can make you better, right?
And take care of yourself, because the other piece that happens, right, is that people get stuck in either or thinking, right? And a manifestation of that is, well, if I am to be a good white boss, or if I'm going to be a good straight boss, I have to just take whatever feedback in whatever shape it comes and just deal with it and not react. And that's also a problem and not helpful. So when I say, increase your capacity to listen and listen deeply, what that actually means is not just listen with your ears if you have that capacity, because also disability justice, but what do you need to be able to listen? Do you need time? Do you need it to be in an email versus face-to-face? Do you need to decompress afterward? Do you need a support person to talk through this with you? Do you need to say, hey, I'm having a really hard time hearing your message because this is pulling up some stuff for me, but I actually feel really invested in this communication. So give me a couple of hours to get back to you. When, again, referencing Tema Okun's work with white supremacy culture in organizations specifically, it is stunning how they have been able to very clearly outline the tenets and the manifestations of white supremacy in such a detailed way with actionables to follow. And so if people research that and look it up, it includes things like urgency, perfectionism, worship of the written word, defensiveness, quantity over quality, thinking that progress means bigger and more, people's right to comfort, the idea that there is one singular objective way of looking at the world. And those undergird a lot of organizations and, frankly, a lot of leadership development strategies and training programs. And if that is what is undergirding your program, right off the bat, you're going to have some trouble. And what this looks like interpersonally, right, if we're going back to this example of Bianca and whatnot, when people feel hurt, sometimes what they do is they direct that outward, and they get aggressive, or they try to hurt the other person. Other people do the opposite. They hurt themselves and they direct it inward, right? So when I say deeply listen, it doesn't mean deeply listen at the expense of your humanity or your dignity. This is not an excuse to be abused or be berated publicly, but this is a call to be curious and be a little bit more in touch with different ways of communicating and the impact of that communication, right? Because the impact that had for that white executive director was a lot of emotional turmoil, but her career was not hurt in any way by that interaction. Bianca was temporarily blacklisted from working with our organization after that interaction. And so that had a direct impact on the person of color in the situation. And that is a trend and something that very frequently happens, particularly to Black women. And Black women being told that they're angry, that they're too aggressive, that they're too, conflict laden. And if we circle back to what we said earlier, right, that's a very individualized way of looking at the problem that completely absolves the other person or the organization from what they and what the context contributed to that interaction. And it makes it the Black woman's problem rather than the whole systemic thing.
Right. And so this is incredible. So I think it's very, very helpful. The story itself, like I said, I think it's going to inspire folks who are watching this right now to really consider how they handle feedback, how feedback has been handled in the past, and who the messenger of that feedback was, and how it was received. And I think in this conversation, there may be some folks who are really invested and they want to do the work, and they want to take some of the concepts around community accountability and militant self-care and embrace them. For the folks that are trying to consider, okay, how do I take better care of myself, or how do we as an organization take care of each other? What would you say to them if you had to make the case for doing this? And I know that you've talked about investing in your people. Can you expand on that a little bit, just so that as a takeaway for folks, that they are prioritizing this aspect of their work just as much as what might be included in the strategic plan, which if anyone has in their strategic plan something about militant self-care, that's awesome. Share examples, but what would you say to those folks?
That is my favorite question of all of them, because having to argue to make a case or something is one of my favorite pastimes.
Yes, cool.
So there's a couple of different versions, because different things will land for different people, right?
Sure.
And so first of all, if anyone says that they have a singular step-by-step plan for community justice or accountability that they can just give you or come to your organization and implement, please run, because that person is a liar, or that person is not doing the truly responsive work that I'm talking about. They're doing something prepackaged that's probably not going to work for you. So the case for militant self-care, the case for community accountability, and more even like clinical concepts finding their way into, or healing concepts rather, finding their way into organizations. The dramatic case for it is we do so, we don't do this work at our own peril, right? Which might be threatening. Like, well, if you don't do this, you're just going to die, and your organization is going to die, and it's going to be terrible. That's a dramatic version. So I'm just going to put that one first, so we can get to the meatier ones later. The other case, if you are part of a legacy or lineage of resistance or marginalization, whether that's you're a person of color, you're someone who's been repressed because of your religion, anything like that, consider the fact that in your bones, in your DNA, you have capacity and history and legacy of making change, of being a mover and a shaker, and that is a way to honor your ancestry, or the good parts, quote unquote, of your ancestry, to create change. The thing that also relates to that is that you're not alone, and you don't have to do this alone. That's another lie that a lot of systems, including capitalism, tell us, because it is financially profitable very often to make workers feel like they're the only ones struggling, so that they don't collectivize, they don't unionize, they don't work together to challenge the systems that are hurting them. So if you have that lineage, if you have that ancestry, use it, live it. That's part of healing justice. Also, if you had ancestors that died for your privilege to exist, or that died in service of change, this is a way to honor them. Like, they didn't die for you to just be like, I guess I'm not going to have conflict. Honor them in a different way. Another case for it, remember that you're part of the communities that you're talking about or serving, right? So if you're saying, oh, my mission is to help LGBT people, and you are part of the LGBT community, it is critical that you include yourself as those beneficiaries of service, those beneficiaries of kindness, right? And this is also a way for you to model it for other people, whether they see you as modeling it or not. So if you are seen as a leader or emerge as a leader, this is a way of you helping other people through helping yourself, right? So for those of us who may have a hard time prioritizing ourselves, or, I need to help everyone else. I'll leave my self-care to the last minute. Self-care is a way that you can continue your efficacy, increase your productivity, whatever that means, and stay sustainable in the work, rather than burnt out, rather than, maybe resorting to substance abuse as the only coping strategy available to you. If you're more science oriented, right, if you're more scientifically minded, look up the concept of allostatic load, and specifically allostatic overload, which in short is a term used to describe the cumulative effects of our bodies trying to deal with stress, and what our bodies and our endocrine system and sort of the neurology of our body does to try to deal with that. And when our bodies are chronically stressed, in the moment, we might not realize all the impacts, but there are so many long-term health impacts of chronic stress all over our bodies, on our livers, on our nervous system, on our emotional regulation, on our weight, on our ability to digest food, on our memory. Like, so thinking about long-term, what we're doing that is harmful to our bodies and thus harmful to our efficacy and thus harmful to our movements is a really good reminder, because this is not just, well, let's just all hold hands and have feelings together. This is, if we don't build community, we are figuratively and, emotionally and literally wrecking our bodies, which are the vessels that we use to do our work, right? So until someone can tell me how to do work from beyond the grave in a way that feels really effective, let's focus on the fact that we have bodies right now that are having cortisol overload that is not helping us. Another case for this, right, is because it'll make us feel better.
Yes.
We need to challenge and change the systems that tell us that we need to be in pain and exhausted to matter. And in a lot of organizations and in a lot of professions, mental health, law, education, medicine, the point of pride for a lot of people is, well, I haven't slept in 5 years. I never slept. I have not eaten in, 20 hours. I have been awake for, and that specifically, that badge of honor, we need to deeply challenge, because it doesn't actually help us or our movements. And what that leads to is vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, burnout, annoyance in general, and those inevitably and cyclically crush us. They take away our empathy and our capacity for empathy. They make us avoidant. They make us ineffective. They disconnect us. Like, I could continue the list of harms that these things cause. So unless you're excited, right? Maybe there's someone out there who's excited to not have empathy and be burnt out and feel like crap all the time. Do it up. Do whatever you want. But unless you're excited about that, these are good cases for this. And if you have money as your bottom line, right? If you're purely the most capitalistic person I've ever met, that will be challenged, right? So some of you will not actually be able to get the capitalist dreams that you seek. However, in some cases, having healthier, happier employees gives you better yield, period. Yep. It does mean that you have to invest in them. It means that you have to give them benefits. You have to give them better leave policies, parental leave that's not just for, a week or for a singular parent. It means healthcare that covers surgery and hormones for folks who are trans or want to alter their bodies in some way. It means that you have accommodations for mental health and to comply with ADA regulations. It means a lot of different things. So it's not free, right? But it has such a high yield that I think it's worth it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh my gosh, this is so good. Okay. So jumping back in. So I really love that when you're making the case, you center people first, you center relationships. You definitely talk about if an organization doesn't do this, it's at their own peril. And there is the case if you're just motivated by the bottom line, it's a good investment. It's a high yield. So I really, really appreciate that. Aida, to kind of, as we're rounding out the interview, I was hoping that you could, if there's something about this topic that we haven't yet covered, that you really feel strongly that participants of the summit really need to know, anything about community accountability, militant self-care, the floor is yours. Like, leave us with the inspiration to take care of ourselves and obviously work towards building better organizations.
Excellent. I'll give you a couple of nuggets to round it off.
I love it.
When we're talking about community accountability, this is about acknowledging the dignity and humanity of all parties. It does not mean, that we're just like, well, everyone's equally responsible and, well, they didn't mean to. I can acknowledge your humanity and your dignity while at the same time saying, this was wrong, what you did, and let's change it, right? So not to confuse the acknowledgement of dignity and humanity with it being quote unquote a soft approach, because that's one of the critiques that people have that don't know community accountability or specifically restorative and transformative justice work. Like, that's soft, right? Like, why, if someone murdered someone, you just want them to sit in a circle and talk about their feelings? No, that's not the only thing that we want them to do. And also, having to sit in a circle facing the victim of your crime or facing the victim, I wouldn't use that language, facing the victim of your harm.
Sure.
Some people explicitly choose to go through the criminal justice system rather than do that because that is harder.
Yeah.
Because RJTJ, community accountability, are lengthy processes, which again is an investment for a society that wants a quick fix. It's not going to give you the quick fix, but for a reason, because a quick fix is a Band-Aid. And if we have a gaping wound, a Band-Aid is not really the solution, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about the dignity, thinking about the long term rather than just the quick fix, thinking about the context of it all, thinking about not just getting back to status quo, right? So if the solution for the problem that you suggest just brings it back to the baseline that it was at, it's not actually transformative, right? Like look at the causes that allowed this to happen in the first place. That's going to give you better prevention outcomes than just getting back to the status quo. Another piece that I would love to name is the importance of saying no. And having boundaries. Yes. And boundaries, not just as what we keep out, but also what we keep in and invite. There's a book called Living in Liberation by Christian Storm that is slim. It's short, very nuanced, and very good at discussing how to set boundaries. Another recommendation from Bianca, so I want to shout her out too. Yeah. And it can be, what if there's a book club at your organization? What if you take excerpts from this book and practice boundaries? And again, boundaries as what do I want to move toward rather than simply what am I running away from or what am I trying to keep out? So that's a little bit of a more positive strengths-based way of looking at it. And again, no as a gift, right? A lot of people, specifically folks who are raised or socialized as women or folks who are raised under particular cultures, we're taught or they're taught to acquiesce, to not say no. Saying no is a bad thing. Saying no makes you a bad person. And dismantling that idea in itself can be huge. And thinking about the way that I look at it with militant self-care specifically is I say no to this and now because I want to leave space to say yes to something else that I want more or is more aligned with my values or my life and its bandwidth.
Yes.
So rather than, no, I'm just denying opportunities, I'm not doing the work, think of it as a future yes that you're making space for, which again, it means that we have to look to the future, not just be dealing with crisis in the moment. And being able to say no, if that's hard, figure out the things that you need to do to make that easier. Does that mean you write scripts ahead of time? Maybe. Does that mean, a personal example, I hate saying no to clients. I hate saying I can't work with you or I'm not the right fit or I don't have time or whatever, especially if it's because it would cut into my personal healing time. I hate doing it. It gets easier, but I don't like doing it. Right. A thing that makes it easier for me is knowing who to refer.
Yes.
So, I recently got a request from someone to do translation between English and Spanish. That is not the primary thing I'm doing right now. I don't super have time for it. Could I make time for it if I didn't go to the gym or something? Sure. That would be a terrible choice. Yeah. However, it makes me feel better if I can say, you know what? I can't do that right now for whatever reason, but here's 3 other people who can. And that's also a part of building community because to know who to refer to, you need to know who's doing what, who's in your circle, and how good are they at their job that you would want to refer to them, right? So that is also a way to do the community building that I said as a part of your job, not as something adjacent and extra. And it's also a way to move resources, right? So if you're someone who is very privileged as a speaker or is very sought after as a presenter, who else can you bring aboard, right? Can you say, hey, I would like to speak at this, but can I bring this other speaker so that they can also share the shine and opportunity? And most of us are taught to only fend for ourselves, that if we bring another person, it takes away from our expertise. It doesn't. And it will continue to do that. It will continue to be a loss as long as we continue supporting and elevating a culture that says so. Yes. So we need to challenge that at every, we don't need to challenge that just in a staff retreat or in a, logistical meeting, but just in our daily decisions of who do we refer to? How do we share rather than think of a scarcity model of I need to hoard every resource because there's not going to be enough.
Yes.
How do we do that? And it's long and hard, but it's so worth it.
This was incredible. I thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge, especially these kind of last few things to chew on, because it's helping us, like you said, kind of really think about how we prioritize ourselves, what we say, the boundaries. I love that part of boundaries of things that we move towards. And part of moving towards what we want is sometimes we have to say no around the things that maybe aren't quite the right fit. And like you said, around building community, if we're saying no, kind of keeping in mind other folks that might be good fits for those things that aren't great for us. So Ida, I thank you so much. Can you please let our audience know the single best place to find you online and learn more about the amazing work that you're doing?
Yes. So aidamanduley.com. That's the easiest way. I'm ridiculously easy to find online because I'm the only one with my name.
Yes, that's awesome.
Google it or just go to the website. Also another place to connect depending on, where you are and what kind of work you do. I'm on social media. And so for some people, that's their preferred method of communication or engagement, right? So maybe you're not ready to work together, but you want to creep on me a little bit and see what I yell about on a daily basis. Those are great ways to do that too. So you can find me on platforms like Instagram under my name, on Twitter, I'm Neuron Bomb, which is not my name, but cute. And just Google me, you'll find me.
Very cool. All right. So for everyone watching, thank you so much for joining. Ida, thanks again for being our featured belonging champion. And don't forget, if you want more time with these talks, I know that there was a ton of value that Ida offered today. If you want additional resources for doing this work in your organizations, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out your options for getting extended access to all this amazingness by checking out the link below. So every purchase also helps me pay for awesome speakers like Ida and their generosity, wisdom, and labor and helping us grow the belonging movement. So again, thanks everyone for joining us around self-care. And again, Ida, you're awesome. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Cool.